The African American Legend series highlights the accomplishments of blacks in the area as varied as politics, sports, aviation, business, literature, and religion. We'll explore how African Americans have succeeded in areas where they'd been previously excluded because of segregation, racism, and lack of opportunity. I'm your host, Dr. Roscoe C. Brown, Jr., and with us today is Dr. Lonnie Bench, Director of the National African American Museum of History and Culture. What a title, what an organization. Hi, Lonnie. Glad to have you.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Now, I grew up in Washington, D.C., and I spent a good deal of my childhood in the Smithsonian. Now, the National Museum is related to the Smithsonian. How did this come about? Clearly, African Americans are a major part of American culture from even before the Revolution, when we were 25% of the population. But frequently we don't get recognized. Now we've got this great museum in Washington, D.C. How did this happen?
Well, this is the 19th museum of the Smithsonian, and it really happened.
What are some of the others?
Well, the National Museum of American History, the National Museum of the American Indian, so that you have sort of 19 museums and an array of research entities that are part of the Smithsonian. So it's wonderful for this museum to be part of that. Mm-hmm. And it really came about, as you know, there has been a desire for almost a century to create an African American museum. It came out even in the years before World War I, when there was a desire to put a monument to the black soldier on the mall, and that failed. There was attempts in the 20s and the 30s, and again after Martin Luther King was assassinated, and then an attempt that we thought would pass in the 90s, but it was stopped by Jesse Helms. So that what happened now is that we now for the first time have a real bipartisan effort. This was really sort of one of the loves of John Lewis, Congressman John Lewis, and he was able to work with Senator Brownback from Kansas, J.C. Watts, the former congressman from Oklahoma, and Senator Max Cleveland, former senator from Georgia. And they put together a bipartisan package that got this museum passed, legislation signed by the president, and I was hired to really make it a reality.
That's right. Now tell us a little about you. Why did they hire you, other than the fact you're good looking and smart? Why did they hire you?
Well, you were talking to my wife. Basically, what they were really looking for is somebody who was a historian, who could craft a museum, and who knew something about the Smithsonian and about the general public. Mm-hmm. And for me, I've been very lucky. This is my third time back at the Smithsonian. I was at the Air and Space Museum in the late 70s. Then I was in a variety of positions at the Museum of American History, leaving as the associate director in 2000. But then I went to do something that's relatively unusual for an African American. I became the president of the Chicago Historical Society. Mm-hmm. So there are very few African Americans that get the chance to run these kinds of institutions. So that when this museum job came open, they contacted me and I said, no, I'll stay in Chicago, I'm happy. But then I realized this museum is really more than a museum. This is really an opportunity to bring reconciliation and healing, but it's an opportunity to honor all our ancestors. And in some ways, as I always said, working in Chicago nurtured my soul, but coming back to Washington nurtures the soul of all my ancestors. How could I say no?
And of course, you're a Howard University graduate.
Well, I went to Howard. I started Howard and then got graduate degrees at American University. So I love being in Washington.
And you work with the legendary Dr. John Hope Franklin.
John Hope Franklin is really the sort of person who helped make me become a historian. He was a teacher, a friend, and now he's become a person that's helped advising me to figure out what this museum should be when we open.
Now, the Smithsonian means a lot to everyone, means particularly a lot to me. I grew up in Washington, D.C., and spent most of my childhood in the various exhibits of the Smithsonian. As a matter of fact, Lindbergh's Spirit of St. Louis plane was placed in the Smithsonian after he flew across the Atlantic in 1927-28. And I went there and fantasized about being a pilot. And from that, I had the opportunity to become a Tuskegee Airman, to be a pilot, and now some of the exploits of me and our organization are in the Air Space Museum.
Absolutely.
So you were there.
That's right.
And we have a great Black Wings exhibit.
And that was one of the works that I worked on when I was in the Smithsonian in the late 70s. So I know all about the airmen, and I'm pleased that with this new museum, we'll be able to tell that story as well.
And the other thing which is just coming about is that the Congress is voting the Congressional Gold Medal to the Tuskegee Airmen as a group, and we hope that it will be repository in the Smithsonian, in one of those great exhibits, maybe in the African American Museum. Now tell us, what's your concept of this Museum of History and Culture? Because as I said, African Americans have been here since 1619. They've been many contributions in science and math and history and economics and agriculture and medicine and sports and education. How are you going to put all this together in one museum?
Well, I think that's both the challenge, but that's also why this is so rich, because the culture, the history is so great. It seems to me that when you create this museum, you want to do a couple of things. You first of all want to make sure that you create a rich insider's view of African American culture. So I want you to understand the power and resiliency of the slave. I want you to tap your toe to Duke Ellington and Aretha Franklin and LL Cool J. I want you to understand what happened when millions of blacks left the South to go to the North. And then I want you to understand the sort of quiet heroicism of a Mamie Mobley, the mother of Emmett Till, or Rosa Parks, and all those that struggled in the civil rights movement. So I want you to get sort of that richness of the culture. And then I want to create the opportunity for all Americans to see that this culture is really the best lens into what it means to be an American. That when you think about issues of optimism, spirituality, equality, where better to look than within the African American community? So therefore, this museum also has to be something that the millions of people who walk down the mall, regardless whether they're African American or not, will find something for them and will understand that you can't understand who America is without understanding the role of Black America.
Well, you know, many of the documents in the Smithsonian are historic. Which of the historic documents related to African American you move from one part of the Smithsonian over to the African American Museum?
Well, one of the joys is that being part of the Smithsonian allows us to utilize the resources of the Smithsonian. So there will be some things that we would use from time to time, but what we're doing is taking the opportunity to craft a national collecting initiative, a kind of national collaboration to save African American treasures. And what this allows us to do is build new collections for the Smithsonian. And it allows us also to create partnerships where you work with regional museums, the Schomburg here, the DuSable Museum in Chicago, the California African American Museum in Los Angeles, and you work with them so that you begin to do these efforts regionally. And then most of the material stays in the local community. Will stay at the Chicago Historical Society or the Schomburg. And then only a small percentage will come back to Washington, the Smithsonian. So we see this as both an opportunity to build on what's there, but what's more exciting is the opportunity to sort of shake this tree and preserve all these materials that I know are in people's homes, attics, and basements.
Well, whenever you build an institution, you have a theme. What really is the theme of the museum?
Well, the theme is simple. It is the notion that the African American story is central to the American story. And so that will be the sort of through line, and that we will be able to tell stories like the role of African Americans in sports, or African American fine arts. Or I want us to do a lot on music. It seems to me it would be very, very powerful to have a large wing of the museum that is shaped on music, from spirituals to gospels to ragtime to jazz to rhythm and blues to hip hop. I mean, it really would give you this wonderful array, an opportunity to see this music and to hear this music. And so for us, it really is an opportunity to tell a full story. But the other piece of this is it also has to tell a broader story than just America. That we have to at least raise the Africa story, the African diaspora, because in some ways our contribution might be to help Americans recognize that they too are part of a global community and that they can't understand their history without seeing the connectivity. And so I think that that's going to be another piece. That won't be the major goal, but that's going to be a piece that you'll also see in the museum.
Now, physically, how do you envision the museum? First of all, where is it going to be? What's it going to be shaped like? How tall is it going to be, etc.?
Right now, we were just able to acquire a site on the mall that was on Constitution Avenue and 14th and 15th Street.
Excuse me, Many people have not grown up or been to Washington. What is the Mall?
Well, let me explain that. The Mall is really the prime green space that runs from the Capitol to the Lincoln Memorial. And that what it is, it's become over the years with all the museums, the best place for most people to come from throughout the world to understand American culture.
So you can stand at the Lincoln Memorial, look past the Washington Monument all the way to the Capitol. And if you remember those great pictures of the March on Washington,
that's right.
We were in front of the Lincoln Memorial looking back across the reflecting pool where the monument reflects all the way back to the Capitol.
Exactly.
That's one of the most stimulating things in the world.
And to be on that site, which allows you to be in the shadow of the Washington Monument, the White House, the Lincoln Memorial, and the Capitol, there is nothing more fitting than for African American culture to be there. And I think that what we're going to do is have a significant institution. We don't know what it's going to look like yet because we haven't hired the architects. But what we know is that the museum has to reflect the sort of richness of African American culture. And my goal is to hire the best architects throughout the world to help us shape this wonderful new museum.
Well, there's the Jefferson Memorial, and there's the Lincoln Memorial, and there's that wonderful building of the Air Space Museum, the National Gallery of Art, such really outstanding architectural features. At one time, at least when I was in Washington, they required you to have a certain kind of marble to be on the mall. Is that still the case, or can they make it out of plastic, or they make it out of aluminum?
There's not a requirement that says it has to be this material or that. But as you could imagine on the mall, because Washington wants to protect that mall, there are an array of agencies that we'll work with that will help us shape what the final design looks like. And in some ways, that's a real opportunity to get the widest array of input from the public, from architects, from artists, so that therefore you make sure that the building does two things. One, it needs to be, as you've said, worthy of the rest of the Smithsonian. So it has to be a building that wows you as being part of the Smithsonian. But even more importantly, it has to be a building that's worthy of African American culture. That's when I know we will have done our job. When the building really sings and makes you feel that you understand the culture that you're exploring.
You know, designing memorials and museums is a difficult task. Right here in New York City, we have the concern about the 9/11 memorial. And different people obviously have different ideas based on where they come from. A number of people in the African American community, when you build African American institutions, want it to reflect Africa. Some want it to reflect the urban community. Some want it to reflect our culture. What's your idea?
Well, at this stage, my belief is that I want to give whoever we hire as architects guidance about the essence of African American culture and life and see what they bring back to us. Because if this was a museum that we were building in 1900, I'd say, well, make it a museum that has a Southern feel, since most African Americans lived in the South. But you can't do that today. So in some ways, the interesting question is, what's African American today? Is it urban? Is it suburban? Is it the music? Is it the words? Is it all of that will be brought to bear to help us create a vision of what this museum will be and what it will look like.
Well, that's a Herculean task, and I know you have a committee or advisory committee or a committee that actually organizes the museum. Who's on the committee? What are their responsibilities, and when are they going to get started?
Well, we have an array of people that are involved, and what I've always said is that the museum exists from the day I started work. We just don't have a building. So that we're creating an array of programs, traveling exhibitions, opportunities for people to engage with this important history and collaborations now. But what we have is we're quite fortunate. We have both one of the most impressive boards called the Advisory Council. And this is a group that includes Oprah Winfrey, Bob Johnson, formerly of BET. It includes Ken Chenault and Dick Parsons and Stan O'Neill, important people who are CEOs of major entities in this city, and that what it really allows us to do is to have the confidence that with that kind of support, that we'll not only be able to raise the money that we need, but that we'll be able to sort of maintain the visibility that will make this a central educational institution. And then tied to that is we have this wonderful array of scholars led by John Hope Franklin, Clement Price of Rutgers University, and Bernice Johnson Reagan, formerly of Sweet Honey in the Rock and the Smithsonian, and an array of people, because in some ways, what helps us make the decisions we need to make is scholarship. And that umbrella of scholarship will shape some of what the building looks like. It'll shape some of the exhibitions that we will do. And so working with them has been really wonderful. And then quite candidly, we've got a very talented group of people led by Kinshasa Holman Conwell, who was here in New York for many years as the director of the Studio Museum in Harlem. And she has come down to become our deputy director of this endeavor, so that what we have is really one of the most gifted group of people that is helping us do this. And that's the joy of this job, is that people around the country realize that this is a special moment. And so everybody wants to help. Now, they may have their own opinions, but what we can do is we can go to the smartest historians, educators, filmmakers, to help make this work.
Now, if someone wants to become involved, first of all, you need to raise money. How much money do you need to raise?
This museum will probably cost anywhere between $400 and $500 million, and the legislation says that Congress will pay for half. So therefore, part of the job is both raising $200, $250 million from the private sector, but also working with Congress to make sure that their interest remain strong so they can give us the money that we need.
Well, Congressman John Lewis, who originally was a member of SNCC, Southern Leadership Christian Foundation, was, I guess, the point person on this, but I'm sure the Congressional Black Caucus weighed in very heavily to make sure that this happened. What was the support you received from the President and the various folks on the Republican side of the aisle?
What's been interesting is that an array of people, regardless of what side of the aisle they sit, recognize that this is a story that needs to be told now. The President had come out early to say that this museum needs to be on the mall. When there was some discussion and debate about that, it was wonderful. We've had an array of members of Congress, people like Senator Bill Frisk of Tennessee, and people like Senator Sam Brownback from Kansas, Republicans who have really sort of led the way to make sure this happens. And in some ways, while everybody will never agree on all that we do, because there's going to be controversy and difficult choices, what I find fascinating is that we are really able to draw effective bipartisan support, and being able to keep that is going to be one of the keys to our success.
What's your timeline? When do you actually hope to have this museum open?
This museum is on a fast track for a federal government entity. I hope to have this museum open in less than a decade. And so the goal is to basically do an array of programs around the country now, do partnerships and exhibitions.
Oh, pardon me, you said an array of programs. What kind of programs are you talking about?
Well, we're doing a variety of things. We are doing a major traveling exhibition that Deborah Willis of NYU is curating for us that looks at African American portraiture from the collections of the National Portrait Gallery. And that will travel throughout the United States. We are also doing programming, so that you have sort of lecture series, that you have the opportunity for people to sort of do the kind of work that is important to local community. For example, one of the ideas we're working on is the notion of helping churches to save their history, save their stories. We were struck by the burning of the Pilgrim Baptist Church in Chicago, and how when that church occurred, when that fire occurred, so much of a history of a culture was lost. So we want to help churches around the country preserve that history.
Well, what about technology? How are you going to use technology? Because almost everything is technology. You can almost have the museum on the internet. So how are you going to use technology?
Well, first of all, our belief is that technology is an effective tool It is not the centerpiece of this institution. That we think that we will create a very aggressive and very important and very user-friendly website that will allow teachers and students and the general public to engage the subject matter now.
Now, I was on the internet the other day, and I put in national. I got some information like press releases. Have you developed your website in terms of your concept and so on yet?
The website is under development. And as a result of that, it's something that we want to make sure will be very strong and very useful, because we need it to sort of serve content, but also to let people know the museum exists so that it helps people to drive fundraising, for example. And the goal is really to recognize that while you want to utilize technology, what people want to see in a museum is the authentic. Mm-hmm. They want to see the lunch counter from Greensboro as an example.
Are you going to get that?
Well, I brought it to the Smithsonian originally. But what I want to make sure is that, you know, we might want to get, you've got to have a slave cabin that people can see. Mm-hmm. You've got to have a shotgun house. Mm-hmm. You've got to have, I'd love to have a Pullman Porter car, mm-hmm. you know, an actual train car. I'd like to have the trainer that you use down in Tuskegee. Mm-hmm. So that what we want to do is make sure that we have significant objects so people can see them. I want, for example, colored and white drinking fountains. Mm-hmm. I think it's important for people to remember those. And so I think that for us, it is really a combination. Technology, because we want to extend the reach of the museum. We want people, when they go into the museum, to be able to sort of maybe download the music they hear. Mm-hmm. But we also want them to be driven by the stories of individuals, so that no matter what we use, the technology, the artifacts, I want them to hear the individual voices. I want them to remember King and Parks, but I also want them to remember unnamed people whose lives shaped who we are, and whose creativity, courage, and just stick-to-itness changed America.
What kind of corporate support do you have, do you think you'll get? Because clearly the corporations in America were really built largely on the efforts of African Americans, particularly in the agricultural industry, particularly in the automotive industry, some in the coal mine. So corporations really have a role to play in this, although there are a number of competing activities, as the Jazz Museum and the Sports Museum and the Rock and Roll Museum and so on. What are you doing to reach out to corporations?
Well, we think that this story, this message, the centrality of African American culture for all of us, really resonates with the corporate community. When you look at the mission statements of almost every corporation in America, they talk about diversity, they talk about community. In some ways, supporting the Smithsonian, supporting this museum with that wonderful brand name, really is a wonderful option for many corporations. So we expect that this museum will really have a larger corporate donation than many other museums. And we're also confident because we have this wonderful council. When you have the head of IBM and Time Warner and American Express and Merrill Lynch, it helps. They begin to help open doors for you, and by their commitment, they show other corporations the way.
There is a movement, however, to develop a Martin Luther King memorial somewhere near the Jefferson Memorial, and that's about another $400 million. So how are those two museum memorials interacting as you do fundraising and so on?
Well, I think several things. I think, first of all, what we make clear is these aren't in competition, that the stories that we tell, a broader story of a museum, complements the story of Martin Luther King and what the monument will do. We are in communications with the King Memorial folks to begin to work on how we work, how we work better together. But the bottom line is that we really celebrate that memorial, and we think it's really something that will happen while this museum is also happening.
Do they have congressional support and congressional funding as well?
I'm not sure on all the particulars of the memorial, but what I do know is that obviously to get the site, there was congressional support and there's great interest, and there's nothing worthier than Martin Luther King. So we think that that story and the story of the African American experience writ large will go together hand in hand.
As a historian, you know, sometimes it takes hundreds of years for the reality of what happened to become a part of the culture. I mean, we have this story of George Washington and the cherry tree, Abraham Lincoln out there giving his speeches and so on. Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks are part of this culture, but so are people like Paul Robeson and Louis Armstrong and Fannie Lou Hamer and Jackie Robinson. How are you going to put all that together?
Well, I think that's the wonderful part of this, is that we don't have to do a simple linear show that says it's 1605 and walk your way to the present. There are ways that you can put together exhibitions on creativity that allow you to look at the virtuoso of Louis Armstrong, but you'll also be able to look at the creativity of Romare Bearden. So that therefore we're able to make sure via the way we look at history and culture that we can tell those array of stories. And then, as you said, we also use technology. There are some stories you tell in a museum, some you tell on the web, some you work with other museums around the country and make sure those stories are told there.
If anyone wants to send material or so on, how do they get in touch with you?
Well, what most people will do is will go on the website. There is a general website for the Smithsonian that links to ours, or there's a website for the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And that's the way to sort of begin to contact us. It's also a way for those who want to give a donation to help the museum exist.
But today on African American Legends, we've been talking with Dr. Lonnie Bunch, who's the director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. This is quite an event, and thanks again for sharing it with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you.